Chapter 32 Reagan. I opened my eyes back inside the mountain. To my relief, Elliot was still right beside me, but his hand clutching mine with a death grip that made my bones ache. What? He asked, looking around. Are you serious? We were just here. Come on, I said, bolting down the hallway toward the dorms. We were almost there when I heard something and threw an arm out to catch Elliot as I skidded to a stop. He let out a muffled grunt as my arm caught him in the stomach. Before he could say anything, I slapped my hand over his mouth and dragged him into the shadows. My heart was hammering and inside my chest, but I could just make out the sound of two hushed but all too familiar voices. Elliot tensed. He heard us too. I carefully took my hand off his mouth as a second later a different Elliot and Reagan emerged from the darkness, creeping down the hallway in their pajamas. Not a different Reagan and Elliot, I reminded myself as we watched the figures disappear around the corner, a past version of ourselves. That was earlier that night, heading toward the glitch room with no idea how we were going to get the door open. Present, Elliot's jaw had dropped open, and I reached over and put my hand under his chin, closing his mouth with a faint click of teeth. Roused from his shock, he turned to look at me. Come on, I said, darting out of the shadows and toward the dorm rooms the past versions of ourselves had just left. Elliot caught up to me right outside the door. Get Sam, Corbin, and Blake and get back to the academy, I said. I'll be right behind you. To his credit, Elliot didn't try to ask me a million questions. Instead, he just turned and disappeared through the dark doorway of the boys' dormitory. I realized that it was just because he trusted me. I let that sink in for a second before entering the dorm that I'd left only an hour ago. Well, I amended. The Reagan I'd just seen in the hall had only left it a minute ago. I shook my head, choosing not to think about how muddled and confusing time traveling was if you really thought about it long enough, and slipped into the dark dorm room. My first instinct was to turn on the lights, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I decided against it. I was outnumbered, and the element of surprise was going to be key. I moved quickly over to Tessa's and Eliana's beds, clicking the chaos cuffs onto their wrists before they were even awake. I was just turning to Serena's bunk when I felt an arm snake out around my neck and squeeze. Drop it, Serena hissed in my ear as something sharp pressed against the small of my back. Serena, it's me, Reagan, I said. Reagan? She said, removing whatever had been stuck in my back and letting go of my neck. Before she could ask anything else, I had the cuff on her right arm. A second later, I was pressing the activation button on her cuffs. Leaning over, I quickly activated Ileana and Tess. Everything went dark, and to my utter relief, I found myself back on the platform in the Academy's hub. But this time, instead of Elliot, I was standing next to Tess, Eliana, and Serena. To my surprise, Tess was somehow still asleep. Eliana was blinking groggily at the room while Serena stood frozen, her eyes flicking from platform to platform so fast I wondered if she was making herself dizzy. A moment later, Elliot appeared, mid-struggle with a very angry Sam and an equally confused Corbin and Blake. Appearing on the platform distracted Sam for a moment, and Elliot managed to pull himself free from the headlock Sam had him in to come stand by me. Are we? Serena said, and Sam whipped around to his face his sister, his expression relaxing just a hair at the sight of her, and for the first time I understood, because I felt a tangible weight lift off my shoulders the second Elliot reappeared. Listen up, I said, and everyone jumped as my voice bounced back at us in the cavernous hub. Tess sat up with a start, looking around herself with such a baffled expression on her face that I almost laughed. Sorry, I said, but we don't have much time. Are we at the academy? Sam asked. We are, I confirmed, and in less than an hour this entire island is going to explode unless we do something about it. Sam was the first one to catch on, and he walked over to stand next to Serena. What do we need to do to save the academy? He asked. Wait a second, Corbin said, his head still on a swivel as he looked around. Is this the past? And if it is, then that makes us criminals, butterflies, time-traveling trespassers? Elliot said. All of the above. Welcome to the club. I held up a hand before anyone could say anything. Listen, I said. We'll explain, and if you want to go back to the mountain, that's your call. We can't force you to be a criminal. But, spoiler alert, Elliot said, the mountain is about 45 minutes from collapsing in on itself from an attack. So there's that. So no matter what, in less than an hour we could all be dead? Tess said with a nervous glance at her cousin. Right, I nodded, hoping my face wasn't giving away how nauseous her words had just made me feel. But if you stay here, we have a chance to save the Academy and ourselves. A very small chance, Elliot added. So what's the plan? Serena asked, and I thought I heard Elliot snort, but I ignored it and pulled the schematics page from Salzburg's prototypes from my pocket. All too aware of the time we were currently wasting, I jumped into a condensed version of what had happened so far, from the mountain getting attacked to our initial jump back to the academy, my deduction about the cameras, and borrowing my mom's key. And this guy, Salzburg or whatever, said Blake when I was done. You really think he's the one responsible for all this? I mean, he's an officer, right? 10 to 1 says he's a Mayhem member, Corbin said. There are the only ones big enough and awful enough to plan something like this. His eyes went wide as he turned to us. Whoa, what if there are lots of professors acting as secret double agents? Professor Tremon was a real jerk back at the academy. I could totally see him as a double agent. Couldn't you, Blake? Trebron? Blake said. Dream on, that guy's never broken a rule in his entire life. Besides, I'm not convinced the Salzburg guy has anything to do with mayhem. I mean, isn't it totally possible that he was just stupid and manufactured bombs on an accident? He's not stupid, I said, feeling my jaw clench as I remembered his oh so timely transfer to the mountain. He might be, Elliot said, and we all turned to look at him. Why? I asked. Well, he transferred himself right out of the frying pan and into a fire, didn't he? Why go to the mountain if he was just going to attack it next? It makes no sense. Maybe it was an unrelated attack, said Serena. One attack at a time, I said. We fix this one, and then we figure out how to deal with the mess at the mountain. So, just to clarify, we have less than an hour to find 25 bombs, Sam said. 24, Elliot said, removing the small black explosive from his pocket. Gah! I yelled, jumping backward, my hand to my heart. I forgot about that one. I didn't, he said, turning it over in his hands. So that's a bomb, Tess said, leaning in to get a better look at it. Sam took it out of Elliot's hand and peered at it for a few seconds while it was a bug under a like it was a bug under a microscope before handing it back to him. It's a bomb, he said. We can't disarm it? Ileana asked. Elliot shook his head. It would take too long, and I've never seen anything quite like this before. So we don't disarm them, I said. We find them, all of them, and we get them off the island. We can meet at the west gate, I said, thinking about the boat we used to get to the mountain. Wait a second, Elliot said, turning to me. We can't just send everyone out in their pajamas. We can't? I asked, because honestly, that had been my plan. Elliot and I had been running around in our pajamas. That's a good point, Sam said. If we manage to pull this off, we don't want to be recognized. I shared a glance with Elliot because we had already been recognized by my mom. It was too late for us. Even if we survived this, we were looking at a life behind bars. For a second, that thought made my insides go cold, but then I gritted my teeth. It was better than the alternative, and it would be worth it if we could save lives. Right, Serena said, nodding at her brother. Otherwise, we'll glitch back to the present and find ourselves under arrest. Speaking of arrest, I said, jerking my head toward the chaos cuffs we used to bring them here, keep those on you. After we get rid of the bombs, we're going to need a quick exit out of here. Good thinking, Sam said. Well, if we need disguises, we're in the right place, Serena said, already jogging over to the far wall, where rack upon rack of costumes sat, waiting to outfit glitchers as they traveled to the past. We turned to see everyone else hesitating on the platform and rolled her eyes. You said the butterfly alerts went off on campus, right? She asked. So if they want butterflies, let's give them butterflies. She ripped a blood red ball gown off a hanger along with the matching and feather masquerade mask that went with it. Try to cover at least part of your face, folks, she said, holding it up so only her blue eyes showed through. The less of us they can see, the less they can identify. Good call, Sam said, vaulting off the platform to join his sister. I think there is some World War I gas mask in there somewhere. With that, everyone sprang into action, grabbing costumes off the rack and yanking them on over their crumpled pajamas. Elliot tossed me an Alcatraz prison uniform, and I glanced up at him, eyebrow raised. Trying to be funny? I said, yanking the shirt and buttoning it up. He stared at me in confusion with a second before realization dawned on him, and his face went pale. Sorry, I said. I forgot you're not really funny. Probably too soon to joke about life in jail anyway. My bad. Before he could respond, I caught sight of the clock on one of the computers, though, and the smile fell off my face. I quickly yanked on the rest of the disguise. Everyone ready? I asked, tying the red bandana Elliot had handed me into a knot so it covered the lower half of my face. Looking up, I saw the weirdest mismatched group I'd ever seen. There was Alcatraz Elliot and Serena in her full ball gown and mask. Sam had found two World War I gas masks, and he and Corbin both were wearing the ratty uniform of a soldier fresh from the trenches. Tess and Eliana had taken a different route, disguising themselves in the raggedy, washed out clothing of Dust Bowl victims, complete with large circular goggles and cloth wrapped faces. Blake was dressed like Elvis, complete with oversized sunglasses and sideburns that took up half his face. It would have to work. Beside, me and Elliot snorted, and I turned to look at him, eyebrow raised. For a guy who spent the majority of his life with a scowl permanently embedded on his face, how in the world was he possibly finding this funny? Sorry, he said, flapping a hand. It's just this went from the worst Easter egg hunt ever to the weirdest Halloween group I've ever seen. No trick or treater has ever been this historically accurate, Corbin said, stepping forward to peer over my shoulder at the map. Or good looking, Blake said as he gave his black Elvis wig a twist so it curled down his forehead in a perfect spiral. You two are impossible, Sam muttered as he jerked his head up the map. Let's get a move on. I nodded and ripped the piece of paper 3 times so I was left with 4 equally sized pieces. Time to divide and conquer, I said, handing one piece to each of the partner groups. As they studied their section of the map, Elliot leaned in, and together we stared at our own section. The Revere and Roosevelt building and my old dorm, Elliot murmured. Those are big buildings. We need to hustle. See you at the gate, Serena said as she and Sam dashed out the door in a swish of blood red skirts. To my surprise, Tess and Ileana both stopped to give Elliot and me a quick look. Fierce hug before flying out the door after Serena and Sam. What was that for? Elliot asked, looking after them in confusion. It's a friendship thing, Corbin said, clapping Elliot so hard on the back he stumbled forward a step. Don't let it freak you out. With that, Corbin and Blake disappeared out the door too. Elliot watched them go. Are they our friends? He asked. I think so, I said. He nodded and turned his attention back to me. Do you think this will work? Only one way to find out, I said as I jumped off the platform and together we ran for the door. We were outside in the cold night air within seconds, and I pushed myself to run faster. Even with our new reinforcements, we were going to be cutting it close to find our explosives in time. The first one was located in the Roosevelt building, and we took a sharp right and raced down the short path, through the dark playground and up the stairs to the wide glass double doors. I'd attended all my elementary level classes in this building, and I knew the halls well. I gave the doors a firm yank, but nothing happened. I groaned in exasperation. Of course the building was locked. I was just fumbling for my mom's key when Elliot threw out a hand to stop me. I turned to see him pointing above the door, where a familiar black camera was mounted to the red brick. Bingo. The next 4 explosives that proved to be easier to find than I had ever hoped. Instead of being hidden in the heart of the buildings, they were located outside. Hidden in plain sight, as I muttered as I yanked the 5th and final one off the concrete wall of the Revere building and carefully tucked it inside the backpack I found abandoned on the playground. The cloth over my mouth was making it hard to breathe, and I yanked it down around my neck so the cold night air could fill my lungs. We might actually pull this off, Elliot said just as we rounded a corner and ran full force into a group of security officers. My face collided with the first officer's chest plate, and my nose gave a sickening crunch. Black spots erupted momentarily in my vision as I was knocked flat on my back. A second later, I was blinking up into the faces of 4 very concerned security officers. Cadet Fitz, said one, holding out a hand to help me up. What are you doing out past curfew, dressed like that? We had a butterfly alert. It isn't safe. I let him help me up, my brain going a mile a minute as I worked to think my way out of this. A quick glance at Elliot revealed him clutching his right eye as another officer helped him to his feet. They obviously had no idea that we were supposed to be miles away inside a mountain. That was good. I could use that. I held my hand up to my nose to stem the stream of blood that I could feel running hot and wet down my chin. Oh, geez, said another officer. She's bleeding. We just made Commander Fitz's kid bleed. Can we get fired for that? Whispered another one. Not you, said another one. Jones, maybe. She ran into him, and then it clicked. Quick, I said. My mom, the butterfly. He attacked us. I've been trying to find help. I gestured frantically back in the direction of my house, and that was all it took. All four guards snapped to attention at my words and took off at a full sprint toward my house, yelling commands into their communicators as I took my story hook, line, and sinker. Elliot came to stand beside me as I disappeared around a corner. I'm impressed, he said. You didn't even really have to lie. I know, I said, swallowing hard. I just left out that the butterfly was me. Before I could think any more about what my mom would say when the officer showed up, I spotted the clock tower. We had 5 minutes left.